21. That first shower was followed by many others over the next couple of days. But to the troops in the four fortresses the rain brought little relief. In the wake of the showers the stifling heat would quickly return, as if to warn that the real storm had yet to come. For Kesri the showers became a new source of worry, to add to those caused by the disappearance of the young fifer. Whether the boy had deserted or been kidnapped he did not know, either was plausible, but he was determined to prevent anything like that from happening again. Now, every time a patrol was caught in a shower he sought shelter immediately. When on the march he would position himself at the rear of the column to make sure there were no stragglers. The rain also brought new torments. It added the odor of mildew to the stench of the enclosure where the men were bivouacked. Swarms of fleas appeared, to join forces with all the other insects that plagued them. Their bite was so vicious that even on parade it was hard to keep the men from wriggling and scratching. There was so much moisture in the air that inspections had to be conducted twice daily to make sure that the sepoys' powder was dry. Yet Kesri knew full well that the state of their powder would be immaterial if they were attacked during a shower. It was this fear above all that now haunted him, of being caught in a situation where their brown besses would not fire. He could only hope that the troops would be withdrawn from the four fortresses before a major storm blew in. But the progress of the negotiations was not encouraging. Although the mandarins had fulfilled some of the conditions of the armistice, the withdrawal of troops from the city, for instance, they continued to procrastinate over the paying of the ransom money. To raise $6 million was not easy, they had protested. They needed a few more days at the very least. And while they tried to find the funds, the British force had to remain where it was, poised above the city and ready to strike. It was the knife at the mandarin's throat. But while they remained there they had to forage to sustain themselves, and with each passing day it became more difficult to extract supplies from the villagers. No longer were they terrified of the foreign soldiers. Often they would spit and hurl stones, gangs of urchins would shout insults, people would block the roads to stop the foraging parties from entering their villages and hamlets. An even more ominous development was that groups of young men, armed with pikes and staves, had begun to confront the foraging parties. On occasion shots had to be fired to disperse them. The soldiers too became increasingly aggressive as the days went by. Although Kesri was able to restrain his own men, he saw plenty of evidence to suggest that discipline was fraying in many units. There were rumors of beatings, looting, vandalism and also of attacks on women. One day Captain Mee told Kesri that charges of rape had been brought against a havildar and some Jawans of the 37th Madras. They had been accused of invading a house and molesting the women. But when Kesri questioned the Madras sepoys he was told a wholly different story. The havildar said he had been passing through San Yuenli, with a squad of sepoys, when he saw an angry crowd gathering around a walled compound. Thinking that a foraging party had been trapped inside he ordered the sepoys to fire into the air, to disperse the crowd, after which he had entered the compound to see what was afoot. The situation inside was not at all what he had imagined. Instead of a foraging party he had come upon a ragtag bunch of British swaddas. There was a smell of alcohol in the air and the sound of women's voices could be clearly heard, echoing out of the house. There was no mistaking those terror-stricken screams. The havildar had recognized one of the men there, an English corporal. But before he could ask any questions he had been shoved out of the compound, with warnings to mind his own business and keep his gob shut. On returning to his bivouac he had decided to report what he had seen to the company commander. This had turned out to be a bad mistake. When the corporal was summoned for questioning he had blamed everything on the sepoys. It was they who were now under investigation. Kesri didn't know what to believe but duly apprised Captain Mee of the Madras sepoys' story. After hearing him out, Captain Me shrugged. "Well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, Havildar," he said, "that in situations like these it's always easier to blame seaboys. Gee, Captain Sabi. And in this instance it's a Madras Havildar's word against an English corporal's." There was no need to say any more. The Ibis was still a long way from Hong Kong when a bank of dark cloud hove into view on the horizon. The sight came as no surprise to Zachary. In the week that he had spent at Whampoa, waiting for the convoy of merchant ships to leave, he had seen plenty of signs of bad weather ahead. And the barometer, which had fallen steadily as the Ibis was sailing down the estuary, had removed all doubt about what lay in store. But Zachary guessed that it would be a while yet before the storm hit the coast, probably not till early the next day, which meant that with any luck there would be enough daylight left for him to call on Mrs. Burnham, in the Anahita, when the Ibis reached Hong Kong. But when the convoy drew abreast of the island, the Anahita did not immediately come into view, even though the bay was unusually thin of vessels. Evidently many skippers had decided to move their ships elsewhere, in anticipation of a storm. This was for the best, of course, since it reduced the possibility of collisions, but that was small consolation for Zachary, who had been looking forward to seeing Mrs. Burnham. But it turned out that the Anahita had not left Hong Kong Bay after all. She was merely hidden behind the Druid. She was anchored at the eastern end of the bay, abreast of Mr. Burnham's recently built go-down, at East Point. Zachary took the Ibis in the same direction and hove to within 2 fathoms of the Anahita. As soon as the schooner was properly anchored, he called for the longboat to be lowered. Within 15 minutes Zachary was within hailing distance of the Anahita. Scanning the decks, he spotted a familiar daub of saffron bobbing about on the main deck. "Is that you, Babu?" he shouted, through cupped hands. "Yes, Master Zikri. And how are you? Hale and hearty, I hope?" "Yes, Babu, never better. Is Mrs. Burnham aboard?" "Correct, Master Zikri. Ba Memsabi is here. I have a message for her, from Mr. Burnham." "Please tell her I'm coming aboard right now." "Yes, Master Zikri, Ekdam Jaldi." By the time Zachary had climbed up the Anahita's side ladder, Babu Nob Kisan was back on the main deck, waiting to greet him. "Babu, you know there's a storm coming, don't you?" said Zachary. "Yes, Master Zikri. I will go ashore this evening, for safekeeping. Ba Memsabi will also go. We will sit in Mr. Burnham's go-down. A room has been specially prepared for Ba Memsabi. Only sailors will remain on Anahita." "I'm glad to hear that," said Zachary. "And where is Mrs. Burnham now? Did you give her my message?" "Yes, Master Zikri. Ba Memsabi is waiting you on the quarterdeck." "Thank you, Babu." Zachary stepped up the companion ladder to find Mrs. Burnham standing alone by the bulwark, watching the sunset. Her white carriage dress had taken on the rosy sheen of the sky and her hair was glowing in the fading light. Zachary came to a sudden stop. Her allure had never been greater and something began to ache inside him. It was like the soreness of an old wound, a reminder not just of the injury itself but also of its cause. When Mrs. Burnham greeted him by saying, "I am very happy to see you, Mr. Reed," it was as if a scab had come off. He told himself that if she was pleased to see him it was only because she was impatient for news of Captain Me, and in the wake of this the jealousy that was seething inside him bubbled up and brimmed over, spilling salt upon old wounds. "I am glad to see you too, Mrs. Burnham," he said stiffly, struggling to keep his composure. "I came because your husband had asked me to convey a message to you." "What is it?" "He has been detained in Canton. He will be back as soon as things are more settled there, perhaps in a fortnight or so. Mrs. Burnham's smile died away and a look of concern descended on her face. "I believe there has been much trouble in Canton of late," she said. "I was very worried about Mr. Burnham, and you, and all our other friends." Zachary could not restrain the sardonic laugh that now burst from his throat. "Oh come, Mrs. Burnham. There is no need to be coy, with me least of all. If you were worried, I am sure it was not on behalf of either your husband or myself." "But you are wrong, Mr. Reed," she protested. "You are never far from my thoughts, I assure you." "But nor am I so close, I'll wager." His bitterness was so powerful now that he could no longer disguise it, as Captain Me. "Come, admit it, Mrs. Burnham, it was for him that you were worried, weren't you?" "Amongst others, yes, certainly, I will not deny it." "Then I am sure you will be happy to know," said Zachary, "that the last time I spoke to him he was in the best of health." Oh? He had wanted to catch her unawares and was pleased to see that he had succeeded. "I did not know," said Mrs. Burnham, "that you were acquainted with Captain Me." "I certainly am, Mrs. Burnham. I made his acquaintance at your husband's suggestion." This too took her by surprise, exactly as Zachary had intended. "But what," said Mrs. Burnham, "did my husband want with Captain Me?" "Surely, Mrs. Burnham," said Zachary, "that question needs no answer?" "I think you know as well as I do why your husband likes to keep a few soldiers in his pocket. You've told me so yourself. It is a lucrative business and your husband has been showing me the ropes. That was why he suggested that I make overtures to Captain Me." Mrs. Burnham's eyes widened. "Are you saying you tried to offer him a dusturi?" "Exactly. And what did he say?" "Oh, he spurned me in no uncertain terms," said Zachary. "He even threatened to report me to his superiors." She had evidently been holding her breath, for she let it out now in a long sigh. "I would have expected no less of him," she said with quiet pride. "He cares nothing for money or worldly advancement." Zachary allowed her to feast on this thought for a few seconds. Then he flashed her a smile. "Well, Mrs. Burnham, I trust you will not be too disappointed then to learn that I was able to bring Captain Me around." She turned to him in shock, her knuckles whitening on the gunwale. "What do you mean, bring him around?" "Only that I succeeded in changing his mind." "But how?" "I told him," said Zachary, "that if he carried tales about me, he would run the risk of being exposed as an adulterer." Mrs. Burnham gasped and clapped a hand on her mouth. "No. You did not dare." "You're wrong there, Mrs. Burnham," said Zachary. "Not only did I dare, I informed him also that he was not the only one to enjoy your favors." "No," she cried. "I do not believe it." "Well, you should," said Zachary, "because it is true." "And what was his answer?" Zachary laughed. "He is, as you know, an impetuous man, so you will not be surprised to hear that he was beside himself with rage. I think he might even have killed me. But once again I was able to get the better of him." "How on earth?" "I told him that I had kept all your letters and in the event of my death they would be found among my effects, in other words, that you would be ruined." This had a rather touching effect. You could even say that it was a tribute to his attachment to you. Mrs. Burnham brushed a hand across her eyes. "Why? What happened?" "Oh," the bluster leaked out of him like air from a puffed-up bladder. "He was evidently quite stricken at the thought that you might suffer harm. I saw then that it would be easy to take him in hand. I told him that it was in order to protect you that he should accept my offer, that he should think of it as a small sacrifice on the altar of love. And then, The sunlight had faded now and her face had turned an ashen gray. I gave him a few weeks to think the matter over. Since his brain is scarcely his swiftest organ, I thought he would need the time. I will not conceal from you that I rather doubted that he would come to a sensible decision. But I must confess that he surprised me. The last time I saw him he was perfectly amenable, quite docile in fact. His words, as I remember them, were, "What do you require of me?" Oh no. Mrs. Burnham's hands flew to her cheeks. Mr. Reed, I cannot believe that you would be so ruthless, so cruel. Oh, but it is you who deserves all the credit, Mrs. Burnham, he shot back. It was you who taught me cruelty, and as you know I am a quick learner. She put a hand on the gunwale, to steady herself, and looked at him with imploring eyes. Please, Mr. Reed, she said, you must release him from this dreadful bargain. I am sorry, Mrs. Burnham, said Zachary. I am afraid the matter is not in my hands anymore. It is your husband who is dealing with Captain Me now. My part was only to reel him in. Mrs. Burnham bit back a sob. Poor Neville, she said. He prizes his honor above all things. For him there could be no worse fate. Oh, but there could, Mrs. Burnham, said Zachary. I think his fate, and yours too, would be far worse if your husband were to twig on to the history of your little dalliance. He paused to scratch his cheek. And all it would take, you know, is a brief chat with the captain's havildar. That is how I myself found out. I'm sure it would not be difficult to arrange for your husband to meet him too. But you wouldn't. Well, Mrs. Burnham, that depends, said Zachary, studying his fingernails. It depends on you really. What do you mean? I expect, said Zachary softly, that you have forgotten a promise you once made to me, that when it came time for us to part, we would have one last night together. I think the time has come for you to redeem your pledge. But Mr. Reed, she whispered the syllables slowly, as though his name belonged to someone she did not know, how can you possibly ask that of me now? After everything you have said? It is unthinkable, unimaginable. I cannot do it. Oh, but you can, Mrs. Burnham. And you shall. If Captain Me can make a small sacrifice on the altar of love, why shouldn't you? Mrs. Burnham was now clutching the gunwale with both hands, as if to prevent herself from falling over. Oh, Mr. Reed, she whispered. What has become of you? What have you become? He was not slow to retort. I have become what you wanted, Mrs. Burnham, he said. You wanted me to be a man of the times, did you not? And that is what I am now. I am a man who wants more and more and more, a man who does not know the meaning of enough. Anyone who tries to thwart my desires is the enemy of my liberty and must expect to be treated as such. Mrs. Burnham began to sob, quietly. Mr. Reed, Zachary, you cannot do this. What you are asking of me is utterly inhuman. Only a monster or demon could contemplate such a thing. I cannot believe that you are those things. It is yourself you have to thank, Mrs. Burnham, said Zachary. It was all your own doing, wasn't it? It was you who decided that I needed to be remade in a more enlightened mold. It might have been better for both of us if you had left me to languish where you found me. But you chose instead to rescue me from that dark, unamiable continent, and now it is too late. Zachary broke off to look up at the darkening sky. It was still cloudless, but the wind had strengthened a little. There is a storm coming, as you probably know. I will arrange our rendezvous once it blows over. And you need not worry, Mrs. Burnham, everything will be done with the utmost discretion. But until then I'd advise you to be careful, It looks as though we're in for quite a blow. I'm glad you are going ashore. A ship is no place for landlubbers during a storm. You'll be safer in the go down. You need not concern yourself with my safety, Mr. Reed, she said, turning her back on him. As I'm sure you know, I am perfectly capable of looking after myself. That night, word was received that 6 million silver dollars had finally been handed over by the Chinese authorities. The money had been transferred to the Blenheim for safekeeping. In the 4 fortresses there was great relief. For the first time in many days, Kesri fell into a deep sleep. But all too soon someone was shouting into his ears, "Havildar Sabi, Utho! Wake up!" It was a little after daybreak and an orderly had brought an urgent message. Kesri was wanted by Captain Me, up in the turret of the fortress. Kesri dressed quickly, putting on a freshly washed vest before pulling on his red cortee. But once again the weather was hot and steamy. Sweat poured off him as he climbed up the turret's stairs, and by the time he reached Captain Me the vest was plastered clammily against his skin. Captain Me was sweating too. "It's going to be another teakettle day," he said, mopping his face, but to Kesri it seemed that there was something different about the heat of that morning. The air was so still and heavy that even the birds and insects had fallen silent. And along the southern horizon there was a broad smudge of blue-black cloud. Kesri looked at it with foreboding. "I think today the storm will come, sir." "You think so?" "Yes, sir, looks like a real typhoon." "Well, it couldn't have picked a worse time." The captain pointed to the rice fields at the foot of the hill. "Look over there." Looking down, Kesri saw that the rice fields were once again swarming with people, but these were not the refuge seekers of the last few days. They were armed men, and instead of fleeing northwards they were heading towards the 4 fortresses. How had so many men materialized in the fields overnight? "You think they are soldiers, sir?" "No, Havildar, they could be irregulars, but they're certainly not soldiers." Kesri took a closer look with the captain's spyglass. He had the impression that the crowd was composed largely of youths like those who had been gathering in the villages over the last few days, except that their numbers had suddenly swelled 100-fold or more. Soon afterwards Captain Me was summoned to a meeting at headquarters. On his return Kesri learned that the general and his aides had taken notice of the crowds as well. They had concluded that something would have to be done to disperse them. As a first step, Mr. Thorne, the translator, had been sent to the mandarins, to demand that measures be taken to break up the gatherings. But nothing had come of it. The mandarins had protested that they had nothing to do with the uprising and were themselves thoroughly alarmed. The crowds had gathered of their own accord. They had insisted, and for all they knew they might well turn against them too. "It's a rabble," said Captain Me to Kesri, "and since the mandarins can't send them home, then we shall probably have to do it for them." At daybreak the sky over Hong Kong was a dark, churning mass of cloud, and there was only a faint glimmering of light to the east. Soon sheets of rain and seawater were blasting head-on into the Ibis, sweeping her decks, from fore to aft. At the same time, colossal waves were coming at her from the rear, swamping her stern. The night before, Zachary had taken every possible precaution, dropping the sheet anchor, taking in the sails and yards, checking and double-checking the anchor cables, battening down the hatches. He had taken care also to make sure that there was a safe distance between the Ibis and every other vessel in the vicinity. The nearest of them was the Anna, he thought, 2 fathoms away, and as far as Zachary could tell she too was holding steady against the gale. Over the next couple of hours there was no flagging in the fury of the wind. But a pale sheen of light slowly spread itself across the sky, so that it was possible, when the Ibis was carried aloft by a wave, to catch glimpses of what the storm had already wrought on the island. Zachary saw that dozens of junks and sampans had been driven aground and battered to pieces. Most of the newly erected shacks and shanties had been blown away too, and many buildings had also been damaged. But the go-downs at East Point, Zachary was glad to see, were unharmed. So long as Mrs. Burnham remained within those sturdy stone walls, she would be safe. Around mid-morning, when the light in the sky was still just a fractured gray glow, the ibis's bows suddenly reared up and began to thrash about in a way that left little doubt that the cable of the bow anchor had snapped. Zachary had anticipated that something like this might happen and had already made a plan. He took a dozen crewmen off the pumps and got them to roll the heaviest of the ibis's cannon forward. On reaching the bows, they attached a cable to the gun and heaved it over the side. The effect was immediate. The ibis's head stopped its wild swinging. As he was turning to go back inside, Zachary's eyes happened to veer towards the Anahita. He saw now, to his shock, that the windows in her stern, which had been closed at last glance, had flown open. Even as he watched, a huge wave rose up behind the ship and went surging through the windows, swamping the owner's suite. Zachary knew that unless those windows were quickly secured, the Anahita would founder. In all likelihood, the crew were not even aware of what had happened. They were probably down in the belly of the ship, working the pumps. How to warn them? Signals and lights would take too long. All Zachary could think of was to fire a shot into the air. Racing down to the captain's cabin, he snatched a musket from the arms cabinet and took it up to the wheelhouse. But as he was trying to prime the gun, he realized that it was a flintlock. The powder was damp and the flint wouldn't spark. He could not get it to fire. The Anahita's stern had already begun to go under. The windows of the owner's cabin had disappeared beneath the waves and the jib boom was standing at a sharp angle to the water. In his heart, Zachary knew that the Anahita was beyond all help already, but to watch and do nothing was impossible. He ran down again to fetch a pistol and came back to find that it was too late. Only the forward half of the Anahita was still visible. Her elegant bows were pointing straight upwards, at the raging sky. For a few minutes the Anahita seemed to hang in the water, her head upthrust, as if to take a last look at the heavens. Through the curtain of rain, Zachary saw a longboat pulling away from her, heading towards the nearby jetty. He began to pray that the oarsmen would row faster, faster, so that they would not be sucked down by the sinking ship. Then with gathering speed, the Anahita began to spin as the water dragged her under. A whirlpool took shape around the stricken ship, and as she was vanishing into it, the spinning whirls seemed to race towards the longboat. But then a wave took hold of the boat and carried it away, pushing it towards East Point. Thank God. The second mate was standing beside Zachary, fingering the crucifix that hung around his neck and muttering to himself. At least the crew's safe. Yes, said Zachary. And thank God all the live lumber had been sent ashore well in advance. At Guangzhou, 80 miles away, the skies were still clear and people were continuing to pour out into the rice fields. Soon crowds were gathering in so many places that it looked as though the British troops encamped in the 4 fortresses were at risk of encirclement. Inside the fortresses, preparations now began in earnest. At roll call, Kesri found that B Company was almost a fifth below strength because of fevers and dysentery. The followers too were much diminished in number and every available man had to be pressed into service, including the cooks and bundaris. At the last minute, Captain Me ordered an equipment check, to make sure that every sepoy was carrying a rain cape. When the bugle sounded, the 4 brigades paraded near the rectangular fortress. The 1st, 3rd, and 4th brigades were ordered to move downhill, to a staging point in the rice fields. The 2nd brigade, which consisted of Marines and armed sailors, was to stay behind to guard the 4 fortresses. The descent took a long time because of the narrow hillside pathways. It was not till noon that all 3 brigades were assembled at the staging point. Directly ahead of them, at a distance of about a mile, was a crowd of some 4,000 or 5,000 men. They were armed with pikes, spears, scythes, cudgels, sabers, and even an occasional matchlock. Some were carrying long staves with hooks at the end. There was an extended wait while the officers studied the crowds. It was the hottest hour of the day, and the intensity of the sun seemed to increase as storm clouds crept in from the south. For the troops there was not a spot of shade. The metal frames of their shakos and topes grew so hot that it was as if they were carrying ovens on their heads. Gaps began to open up in the ranks as men collapsed and were carried away by dolly bearers. Meanwhile, General Goff and his entourage had decided to go a little way ahead, to a shaded knoll. On the way 2 officers were seen to reel and lurch. One was the general himself, but he recovered and was able to walk the rest of the way without assistance. But the second officer had to be held up by others. On reaching the knoll he collapsed, falling forward on his face. It turned out that this was the quartermaster general. Within a few minutes he was dead, of apoplexy, brought on by the heat. This led to further delays, and a good while passed before General Goff finally issued his orders. The brigades were to move in different directions with the aim of engaging and dispersing the mobs. The 4th Brigade was to tackle the crowd that had gathered directly in front of the staging point. The Cameronians were to advance on it from the left and the Madras and Bengal sepoys from the right. The fields ahead were flooded. Stepping into the mud, the sepoys waded forward at a slow, deliberate pace, with their muskets at the ready, the barrels resting on their hips. The crowd began to fall back as the sepoys advanced, but even as it withdrew its numbers kept growing. On coming to a raised embankment, the crowd's retreat suddenly stopped, outlined against a lowering sky. Thousands of silhouettes turned to face the sepoys. It was late in the afternoon now, and the Cameronians had disappeared from view, behind a cluster of houses on the left. The 300 sepoys were on their own now, facing an assembly of 6,000 or 7,000 men. The long trudge through the mud had all but exhausted the sepoys, so a rest was ordered. The respite lasted just long enough for the followers to catch up and for water to be distributed to the sepoys. Then suddenly the crowd began to move towards them in a mass, brandishing weapons and shooting matchlocks. Meanwhile, a contingent of artillerymen had taken up positions to the rear of the sepoys. A flight of Congreve rockets now sailed over the soldiers' heads, crashing into the crowd. The projectiles went plowing through its ranks, leaving behind furrows of fallen bodies. But still the crowd kept on coming, undeterred. Now it was the sepoys who began to retreat, but being weighed down by heavy loads, they could not move as fast as their adversaries. When the gap between them and the crowd had dwindled to a stone's throw, the sepoys were ordered to stop and take up firing positions. The sepoys' first volley decimated the front rank of the crowd, bringing it to a halt. The sky had darkened now and a fierce wind had arisen. A sheet of lightning darted through the clouds, and then, to the accompaniment of peals of thunder, the rain came pelting down, not in drops but in long jets. It was as if the countryside were being bombarded with liquid projectiles. The sepoys were soaked before they could put on their rain cloaks. To fire flintlock muskets was impossible now. Swords and bayonets were the sepoys' only serviceable weapons, and both were shorter in reach than the pikes and spears of their adversaries. The storm was now the sepoys' sole ally, its fury the crowd's only check. Through the roar of the wind Kesri heard Captain Mee's voice, shouting in his ear. The Co had ordered him to make contact with the Cameronians, He was setting off in search of them with a platoon of sepoys. Kesri was to accompany him. "We'll need to take a runner with us, Havildar." "Gee, Captain Sabi." Shielding his face against the driving rain, Kesri went to take a look at the few followers who had managed to keep up with the company. His eyes went at once to Madao and he beckoned to him, "Chow, stay close to me." At Hong Kong the rain kept falling, in torrents, even after the storm had passed over the bay, sweeping northwards, in the direction of Canton. But the fury of the gale quickly abated and the mountainous waves subsided into heavy swells. As soon as it was safe, Zachary called for the Ibis's longboat to be lowered. Climbing in, he ordered the crew to row over to the jetty that led to the new Burnham Go Down. The building was unharmed, but there was so much wreckage all around that it took a while to approach it. Zachary had to hammer on the door for several minutes before he was let in. The Go Down's cavernous interior was lit by a few dimly flickering lamps. Some of the Anahitha's crewmen were kneeling in rows, saying namaz. Some were sitting huddled in the corners, shivering as they hugged their knees. Master Zikri. Turning to his right, Zachary saw that Babu Nob Kisan was hurrying towards him. There was now only one thought in Zachary's mind. "Where's Mrs. Burnham?" he said. "Is she in that room you'd prepared for her?" Babu Nob Kisan took a few more steps and then his enormous head shook slowly from side to side. "Master Zikri, I am sorry." "What do you mean you're sorry?" Zachary snapped. "Where is she? Just answer the question." Again Babu Nob Kisan shook his head. "I am sorry." Zachary laid his hands on the Gamasta's shoulders and shook him hard. "Babu, this is no time for your flamadiddles, just tell me where she is." "Yes, Master Zikri, that is what I am trying." "Mrs. Burnham had changed her mind at the last minute," said Babu Nob Kisan. "She had decided that instead of going ashore, to take shelter in the Go Down, she would ride out the storm on the Anahitha. She had complete confidence in the crew, she had declared, and she wasn't going to allow a bit of a blow to throw her into a funk." Babu Nob Kisan had tried to persuade her to leave, but she had silenced him in her usual imperious way. It was impossible to argue with the Ba-Memsabi beyond a point. At her orders Babu Nob Kisan and a few others had left the ship as planned, to take refuge in the Go Down. The rest of it Babu Nob Kisan had heard from the crew, when they came ashore after the sinking of the Anahitha. Early that morning, before the storm hit the coast, Mrs. Burnham had rung for a steward and asked for a tray of tea. The steward had returned to find her sitting in the owner's suite, beside a window. It was already blowing hard then. She had said that she would be safe there and that she wanted to watch the storm coming in. Once the storm broke, the crew had no time to check on Mrs. Burnham. It wasn't till the ship began to take in water that a serang ran down to the owner's suite. He had found the suite's door jammed, perhaps by a piece of furniture. He had pounded on it, and on receiving no answer he had gone to fetch an axe. But by the time he returned, the ship's stern was already below water, the gangway flooded. He would have drowned if he had stepped in. There was nothing more to be done. But Master Zikri. Although Babu Nob Kisan was leaning close to Zachary now, his voice seemed to reach his ear from very far away. "Last night, Master Zikri, before I departed from Anahitha, Ba-Memsabi gave one letter. For you. She said to ensure that you received." "Where is it?" "Here, I have safely kept." Withdrawing into a corner, Zachary broke the seal and began to read. The platoon set off with Captain Me in the lead and Kesri bringing up the rear. As they veered leftwards, Kesri handed his now useless musket to Madao and took his sword in his hand. The surrounding fields had already turned into a continuous expanse of water, the buns had disappeared and the only points of orientation were a few clusters of dwellings, dimly visible through the rain. Although nightfall was still a while away, the sky was so dark that it was as if the sun had already set. Hearing a sound behind him, Kesri looked over his shoulder. Peering into the failing light, he spotted the misted outlines of moving figures. It occurred to him that these might be the Cameronians, and for an instant he was lightheaded with relief. But then a rock came hurtling through the rain, to hit him in the shoulder, and he knew that they were being followed by the mob. "Halt! Halt!" Kesri shouted, and in a matter of seconds Captain Me appeared beside him, sword in hand. "They're behind us, sir," said Kesri, and as soon as the words were out of his mouth, Kesri realized that he'd spoken prematurely. The armed men weren't just behind the platoon, they were all around, their outlines enshrouded by rain. Suddenly the pointed head of a pike shot out of the curtain of falling water. It would have pierced Kesri's ribcage if Captain Me hadn't struck it down with his sword. Now, as rocks and stones began to fly out of the deluge, Kesri felt something tugging at his ankles and looked down. It was a large hook, attached to a staff. He slashed at it with his sword, breaking it in two. But somewhere to the rear, one such staff had succeeded in hooking a sepoy. He had fallen and was being dragged through the mud. Two sepoys caught hold of the fallen man's arms and pulled him back. When he was on his feet again, Captain Me shouted, "A square! Form a square!" Sluggishly, fending off brickbats with their arms, the men fell into a square. Standing shoulder to shoulder, they thrust their bayonets at every moving shape. After a few minutes, Captain Me's voice was again in Kesri's ear. "We're too exposed here, we have to move. I saw some houses to the left. If we can reach them, we'll have a wall at our back." "Gee, Captain Sabi." "I'll lead," said the captain, wiping his streaming face with his sleeve. "You bring up the rear." The radius of visibility was no more than a few feet now. Only when flashes of lightning streaked through the clouds was Kesri able to see beyond that. When the platoon began to move, he kept his eyes fixed on the darkness, moving backwards, sword at the ready. Projectiles kept raining down on the platoon as it waded through the mud. When at last there was a slight quickening in the pace, Kesri sensed that they were out of the paddies, on level ground. Then he glanced back and saw that a gap had opened up between him and the rest of the platoon. They were already out of his circle of visibility. He would have to hurry to catch up. Just as Kesri was about to quicken his pace, the pointed end of a spear came hurtling towards him, from the right. He brought his sword down upon the shaft and had the satisfaction of seeing the tip fly off. And then, inexplicably, without his being aware of an injury, his left leg crumpled under him, bringing him down heavily, on his back. A flash of lightning split the sky, to reveal a circle of faces, closing in, with pikes and spears pointed at him. Kesri's sword was still in his hand and he tightened his grip on it. He knew that his time had probably come, but he felt no panic, only a kind of sadness that it should happen here, at the hands of men with whom he had no quarrel, men who were not even soldiers, who were trying only to protect their villages, as he himself would have done back home. He saw a shadow moving towards him and slashed at it with his sword. Even as his blade dug into flesh and bone, he felt an impact in his own flank. He was trying to turn when a pike crashed into his wrist and the sword dropped from his hand. And then, as he lay helpless on the ground, he heard a deep-throated voice calling his name, "Kesri Singhji." And he shouted, "Ha! Yaha! Here, I'm here." A bayonet swung out in an arc above him, scattering the faces that had been closing in. "Havildar Sabi." The voice was Madhouse. Kesri answered with a grunt and Madhouse squatted beside him, with his bayonet leveled at the darkness. "Hold onto my neck, Havildar Sabi," said Madao, "and I'll pull you onto my back." Kesri wrapped his arms around Madao's neck and felt himself being lifted up. Then Madao began to back away, with the brown bess circling watchfully in front of him, the bayonet slicing through the darkness. As he clung to Madao's back, Kesri became aware of a searing pain in his thigh. Only now did it dawn on him that his hamstring had been severed, and once he had become conscious of the injury, the pain welled up in waves, almost overwhelming him. As if through a fog, he recognized Captain Mi's voice. "Havildar? What the devil?" And he realized he was back with the platoon, in the enclosed center of a square. On every side of him, sepoys were fending off attacks. "You're losing a lot of blood, Havildar." Through gritted teeth, Kesri said, "Captain Sabi, you go back to the men. Madao here will take care of me." The captain nodded and his face faded away. Meanwhile, Madao had already slit open Kesri's trousers. "Bahut kun ba," said Madao. "There's a lot of blood, I'd better tie up the cut." Madao peeled off his tunic, tore off a few pieces of cloth and bound them over Kesri's wound. Then he reached into a pocket and pushed something into Kesri's mouth. In a second, Kesri's nostrils were filled with the grassy, sickly sweet odor of opium. It was like an answer to a prayer. At the very smell of the substance, the pain receded and Kesri's breath returned. In a few minutes, Kesri heard Captain Mi's voice again. "How are you, Havildar?" "Better, Captain Sabi." "And the men?" "They're doing their best, but if we can't get our guns to fire, I don't know how much longer we'll be able to hold off this rabble." "They're everywhere." An odd calm had descended on Kesri now, and he remembered something he had once witnessed, as a young seaboy. "Give me some rain capes, Captain Sabi," he said. "Let me see what I can do." With Madao's help, Kesri fashioned a tent-like covering with a couple of rain capes. Then he snapped open his brown bess. Digging a sodden cartridge out of the barrel, he told Madao to find him some dry cloth. Madao took off his turban and tore a few strips from the inside, where the cloth was still dry. Kesri took them from him, twisted them into wicks and used them to wipe dry the inside of the barrel. Then he called for Captain Mi and told him to try firing the musket under cover of a rain cape. A minute or two later, he heard the crack of a musket shot, followed by cries in the distance. "That'll scatter them for a bit," said Captain Mi, ducking under the tented cape. "Do you think you could do that again, Havildar?" "Already done, Captain Sabi." As Kesri was handing over the next musket, a shot rang out, in the distance, and was quickly followed by another. "Percussion guns," said Kesri. "Yes," said the captain jubilantly. "I suppose it's the Cameronians. They must have heard our shot." Knowing that help was near, Kesri allowed his head to sink to the ground. By the time the Cameronians arrived, he had lost consciousness.